I'm going to introduce Tom Hardwicke. He's the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow of the University of Amsterdam's Department of Psychology. He received his PhD in experimental psychology from the University College London and has research publication bias in psychological sciences. Tom, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. So good evening, everyone from the Netherlands. It's great to be with you virtually. This study is looking at citation patterns following a strongly contradictory replication result, and we're going to look at 4 case studies in the field of psychology. So we start with this fundamental assumption or expectation about science being a self-correcting enterprise. So the accuracy of scientific knowledge should progressively improve as we update our beliefs in response to accumulating evidence. And replication studies are often considered to be a key driver of this self-correction process because they may indicate that a prior result is exaggerated or erroneous. And I'm using replication study here to mean repeating the methods of a prior study to obtain a new sample of data. Now, importantly, when a replication result contradicts a prior result, that does not necessarily mean that the original result was spurious. There can be many reasons why you get contradictory results. Nevertheless, one might expect that when the results of a high fidelity replication, so when the methods clearly match those of the prior study, and the results strongly contradict and outweigh the results of the prior study, this should have some effect on how that prior study is cited and discussed in the subsequent academic literature. So what we're doing in this project is examining those assumptions empirically. So we adopted a retrospective observational design that involved 4 case studies in which the results of a very prominent and pre-registered multi-laboratory replication attempt strongly contradicted and outweighed the results of a prior study. So let me introduce you to these case studies. The first one was in the context of the facial feedback hypothesis. This is the idea that an individual's emotions are influenced by feedback from their facial movements. The original study in this case was published in 1988, and it's quite influential. As you can see, it garnered 708 citations, and the multi-lab replication study was published in 2016. The replication study is substantially larger than the original. So the original study had 92 participants, and the replication involved 17 direct replications at individual laboratories and over 2,000 participants. And there is a quite clear contradiction in the results as a clear null finding in the replication study. Oh, my slides have frozen. There we go. The next 2 case studies are both related to social priming effects. This is the idea that subtle cues can have large and unconscious influences on human behavior. Both of the original studies in this case were published more recently, 2012 and 2011, and were the subject of replications as part of the Klein et al. Many Labs study, which was published in 2014. Now, importantly, both of those original studies have fewer overall citations, so the patterns that we can look at here are a bit more noisy and variable, and we can't draw as a clear conclusions in these particular case studies. And the final case study we looked at was in the context of ego depletion. This is the idea that we have a limited pool of mental resources or willpower, and this can be used up by activities that require self-control. And as you can see, this case study was a little bit unusual because there's 2 rows in the table here, because there's 2 relevant original studies. The Baumeister et al. 1998 study was the intended target of the replication study, but for practical and technical reasons, they actually adopted a slightly modified methodology that was developed by Sripada and colleagues in a paper published in 2014. So there's 2 relevant target studies in this particular case study. So overall, what all of these case studies have in common is that we have a pre-registered replication study that has a much larger sample size than the original study and provides highly visible and highly credible evidence that strongly contradicts and outweighs the original findings. So we're going to look at 3 types of citation pattern, which I'll describe to you now, and exactly how we measured those different patterns. The first one relates to belief correction versus belief perpetuation. And to measure this, we looked at annual citation counts to the original studies. And we also classified the valence of those citations to the original studies as favorable, equivocal, or unfavorable. So, for example, a pattern that was consistent with belief correction may be that there is a decline in overall citations after the replication study is published. And in particular, we might see a decline in favorable citations and potentially an increase in unfavorable citations. By contrast, if there's a pattern consistent with belief perpetuation, then we might see a maintenance of annual citation counts, in particular maintenance of favorable citations, and perhaps no increase or a negligible increase in unfavorable citations. The second pattern of interest was citation balance or citation bias. And to examine this, we looked at the frequency of co-citation of original and replication studies. In other words, when authors cited the original study, did they also cite the replication study, which would be citation balance, or did they neglect to cite the replication study, which would be citation bias? And the third and final pattern we looked at was explicit defense or absent defense. So when authors cited the original study and they cited the replication, we were interested in whether they provided any explanation for that contradiction in results. And in particular, if they cited the original study in a favorable way, we were interested to see if they were providing any kind of defense of the original findings. So we looked at the frequency and the type of counter-arguments that were used. Some selected comments on our procedure, just in the interest of time. I won't be exhaustive here. The citation counts were obtained from Web of Science. The valence classifications were performed for the year prior to publication of the replication, and then for all years after publication of the replication up until 2019, which is when we terminated our study. We didn't look at the replication year itself because some of the citing articles may have been in the publication pipeline at that point, so it might have been difficult for them to incorporate the replication results into their papers. In one case, the Baumeister study, it was cited so often that it was not really tractable for us to classify the citation valence for all of the articles in the assessment period. So we just did it for a random sample of 40% of the citing articles, and then extrapolated to all articles. And finally, citation valence and counter-arguments were all classified in duplicate by 2 team members. If any disagreements arose, they were resolved through discussion with a 3rd team member arbitrating if necessary. So on to some results, and we'll start with the belief correction perpetuation pattern. And I'll just start with one case study to orientate you to this graph. So we're going to look at standardized annual citation counts across time from 1988, when the original article was published, through to 2019, when our study ended. The replication was published in 2016, which is marked by the black arrow. And you're going to see a solid black line representing citations to the target study, and also a dashed black line, which shows citations to a reference class. This is all articles published in the same journal and the same year as the target article. And all of the citations you see here are going to be standardized to the replication year. So as you can see across time, there is an increase in citations to the target article and to the reference class. And after replication, we see that there's this small decline in the number of citations to the target article. Importantly, then, what we were particularly interested in is the relative change in favorable and unfavorable citation. So these colors show you the proportion of citations that had different valences. So in the year prior to publication of the replication, the vast majority of citations, 88% of them were favorable. And in the post-replication years, that decreased to 78% across all of those replication years. Unfavorable citations, on the other hand, that was 0% in the pre-replication year, and that increased to 7% in the post-replication period. So overall, I think what we see in this one case study is that there's some degree, perhaps of modest belief correction, but generally the pattern is also consistent with considerable perpetuation of belief in the original results, to the extent that that's reflected by a high proportion of favorable citations to the original study. So we'll look now at all of the case studies together. As you can see, we're emphasizing the Strack and the Baumeister cases because there were more citations overall, so the patterns are much clearer. For the other three studies at the bottom of the screen, the patterns are more variable because the overall citation counts are quite low. But generally speaking, the patterns are pretty consistent across all case studies. There's a small post-replication decline in the number of favorable citations. There's a small increase in unfavorable citations, but generally what we see is it's a modest correction effect at best. And these patterns imply considerable perpetuation of belief in the original findings, despite publication of these contradictory replication results. So I'll move on to the second citation pattern now. This is citation balance versus citation bias. Here, I'm just zooming in on the part of the graph in the post-replication years, and we're now looking at the proportion of citing articles that also cited the replication study, shown in orange, or did not cite the replication study, shown in blue. So for the Strack et al. Study, the Baumeister study, and the Caruso study, there's a clear indication of citation bias. So articles citing the original study are not citing the replication results. In the Schrapada and Carter cases, there's perhaps more of an indication of citation balance. So those studies are citing the replication results as well. And the last pattern that we looked at was related to explicit or absent defense. In particular, when researchers were continuing to cite the original article favorably after the replication had been published, and they were citing the replication as well, we were interested in whether they were providing any explanation for that discrepancy. 52% of those articles that co-cited the original and the replication offered an explicit defense of the original study. 48% of them did not provide any explanation for that discrepant finding. And we categorized the defenses that were offered. So these come from 45 individual articles, some of which offered more than one potential explanation for the discrepancy. The most common one that we encountered was related to methodological differences or potential moderating factors between the two studies. So for example, one article stated that ego depletion exists, but its occurrence seems to depend on moderating conditions. The second most common reason was to call upon additional evidence. So for example, one article said, although there has been a challenge to this original finding, there have been many replications of the principle, and a meta-analysis shows a robust facial feedback effect. And finally, the last type of reason that we encountered, but this was quite rare, it only appeared in two articles, sorry, was to suggest that the replication teams had inadequate expertise, and that's what explained their inability to replicate the result. So one article said it is easier to be successful at non-replications, while it takes expertise and diligence to generate a new result in a reliable fashion. So summarizing then across all of those case studies, we see patterns consistent with modest belief correction and considerable belief perpetuation, considerable citation bias, so neglecting to cite these highly relevant replication results, and finally some but limited explicit defense of the original findings in light of the contradictory replication results. Some selected points of discussion, again, just in the interests of time, I'll keep it to just a few key points. We adopted this case study method to provide a kind of narrow but deep approach. It has several advantages, but some disadvantages. The advantages were that it enabled us to do this detailed classification of citation valence, which was extremely time consuming to do manually and in duplicate, and difficult to do at scale. We also deliberately chose a few cases where at least we had a clear expectation that there should have been some degree of self-correction activity. So we only looked at cases where the results were strongly contradictory and came from highly visible, highly credible, and high fidelity replication attempts. The disadvantage of this approach is that, of course, we have a very limited sample. It's not straightforward to generalize beyond these 4 cases. In particular, correction effects may be less likely when replication results are more ambiguous, when they're less consequential, and when they're less well known. A second point of interest is that we've been able to gauge the community's response to these replications, but only to the extent that they're reflected in these short-term citation patterns. There could be other interesting correction effects that we haven't been able to capture just by looking at citations. So it could be that individuals who wouldn't typically cite the original studies, like students, researchers working in other fields, members of the public, etc., may well have updated their beliefs in response to the replication results, but we wouldn't capture any of that in our citation patterns that we examined. And another kind of more general point is that I think there's 2 non-mutually exclusive views of self-correction. One is that it operates on a very short time scale in terms of directly identifying an error or some kind of erroneous problem with a prior study, in which case you might get some kind of short-term self-correction effect. But there's also a longer-term view, which is more indirect and relates to the gradual accumulation of evidence in a particular field on a particular question that might steer us in a particular direction. Clearly here, what we're looking at and what we're able to tap into is that kind of shorter term type of self-correction. So future research might look to employ longitudinal designs or look back at historical case studies where there's a longer history of citation patterns unfolding over a longer time scale, and it might be interested to see how those citation patterns are affected by many different events over the course of time. And a third point is that it's quite unclear to what extent the results that we obtained here are being driven by a lack of awareness of the replication results or a more active decision to discount them. So it's unclear here to what extent we have a practical problem with people just not being aware of relevant research on the topic of interest, or the extent to which we're dealing with a more psychological problem related to updating of belief, or sociological problem related to defending certain theoretical positions, argumentation in research papers, and how evidence is cited to support your particular stance or point. So to conclude, our findings suggest that even replication results that strongly contradict original findings do not necessarily prompt a correction response from the research community. And self-correction may not be as expedient or straightforward as we might expect or desire. Once the horse is bolted, it might be quite difficult to close the barn door. So this further highlights the importance of improving the quality of the academic literature to reduce the capacity of potential misinformation to take root, and then the necessity of having to correct it with future corrective actions like replication. So I'll just acknowledge all of the hard work done by the team that worked on this project. If you'd like to read the paper, you can get hold of it there at that DOI. And thank you very much for listening. I look forward to hearing any thoughts that you might have and answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was very interesting. We have about 5 minutes for questions. There are some questions in the chat.
I don't know if I could ask a brief question. Thanks, Tom. I really enjoyed that a lot. I think the findings are so important because in the debate on improving, research, I've heard so many times, especially within economics, from experimental economists who do lab studies, which are kind of closest to the ones you're talking about here, saying, we don't really need pre-analysis plans. We don't need to pre-register. We don't even, there's all these elements of research transparency that aren't needed because, replications will solve the problem. Lab experiments are easy to replicate. And then once replications are out there, the community will update. And you're showing there's some updating. I mean, it was sort of reassuring that at least there's some dip in citation counts. There's more unfavorable, citations, but it's really partial. And it may take, 3 or 4 or 5 years wasn't enough time. So I just feel like this paper is a very useful piece of evidence in that debate we're having within, say, experimental economics, about the usefulness of all these other tools that we need, because they're so set on replication, just solving all of our problems. So I think it's a really important piece of evidence.
Thanks. Yeah, and of course these are perhaps the most clear-cut cases where we would expect there to be some kind of belief change. So actually, a lot of replication studies have more ambiguous results. So its ability to kind of change minds is much less clear, I think, in the majority of cases.
So Lars was asking 2 questions, and I'm just going to pick one. Did you look at citations to the replication study that do not cite the original study?
Yeah, and to just add on to that, it sort of struck me that one of the effects, you see a decline in the number of citations, and that might occur because people are now citing the replication study and not the original study. And I think that's a very important point to consider, because that affects, is this for or against? That counts.
Yes, that's an interesting point. So we did look at whether there were citations to the replication studies that did not cite the original study. I can't remember those findings off the top of my head, but my general impression was that they were a little bit hard to decipher, because all of these case studies that we looked at involved these extremely prominent multi-lab replication attempts, which were new to psychology. So they were widely discussed beyond the individual fields. So there was something kind of artificial about them. So a lot of the citations that the replication studies were picking up were actually from like meta researchers, for example, who weren't even interested in the actual topic of investigation. or in press articles and things like that. So it was a little bit difficult to figure out what was going on with those.
I mean, that suggests a fundamental problem, because if you just take it at face value, the replication study is a larger study of the same topic. And if I have to choose between a large study that finds one result and a small study that finds a different result, I'm going to pick the one as a large study as the more convincing one, and I'll cite that one, irregardless of if they claim to be replicating some result from the previous one. So if you didn't actually find any citations of the replication study as the fundamental evidence for that particular topic, I think that illustrates a certain problem in the first place.
Great.